Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about my Mythic Plus tier list for Dragonflight. This is going to go over not only what I think is going to be the best in a hardcore competitive environment and everything like that, because I think that's the best frame of reference for what is going to be the best of almost OP, what's going to be most successful when pushing high keys, but I also wanted to talk about how each of the specs is going to shape up in a general environment, and where their sort of averages are going to also end up. And as I go through the different classes, I'll also talk about what I enjoy with them, what I would recommend to people, what I may not recommend to people as well. Big parameter or basis that I have for the tier list that I have going on is what is right now dominant and overpowered. These are some of the classes that I think could be nerfed, but I think that they either the output of damage or healing, the utility that they bring, whatever, makes them in a particularly advantageous environment for the season. There's high-end competitive, where I think that you could see a decent representation of these healers in the mix, but they may not necessarily be very highly represented, because whenever you're looking at what the best healers are going to be brought, even if it's a very popular spec, for example, Druid was a very popular spec for dungeons for a long time, but in Shadowlands, they fell off pretty damn hard, and so everybody re-rolled, right? So in a high-end competitive, it might be something that's overly represented or underrepresented for its ranking, but the base spec in a vacuum could still be very powerful. Third is probably struggle in high key. I think is kind of the best way I had to say it, is that some of these specs have a likelihood or a very high probability of struggling in a high key environment, whether it's because of a lack of output, damage, utility, whatever, that is going to bring them down, but they're still able to get into that like 1% or 0.5% level of dungeons, though it might be difficult to push for a 0.1% title. Finally, the ranking of bad and high key. This would be for any class that I just don't think is going to function well. Historically, this has existed, but in this tier list, I don't think that there is actually any healer that would be bad in a high key environment. So my definition of this is back in Legion, back in BFA, you would have certain healers that were just incapable of healing the content. What I mean by this is going into like Waycrest Manor as like a holy priest or like a Resto Shaman and doing some of the highest keys possible. And the kits that they had at the time in BFA were so poorly suited for a 5-man environment that you almost never saw high key pushing holy priests, high key pushing Resto Shamans. You definitely did not see them in like the 0.1% for those elite titles, but you'd only have like a handful of people that would be doing some of these keys in the like 1%er type range. You'd see maybe a handful or something like that, if at all. That said, overall in Dragonflight, I don't think there's any healer that cannot heal the top 1% and top 0.5% of keys. I do think that you're going to see some healers that could heal 0.1%, but they'll require more heroic efforts, I guess you could say, out of their entire party to be able to kind of get you across the finish line. That is because the Dragonflight dungeons that we're going to be talking about are very different than what you've experienced in Shadowlands. So if you've only played in Shadowlands, listen up. The dungeons in Dragonflight are actual group efforts and concerted efforts to be able to bring down boss fights. Whether it is the usual sort of thought of, hey, damage dealers need to use defensives, duh. But how you're dealing damage, what you're prio targeting, those things matter so much when it comes to boss encounters and the instance as a whole, that healers are not going to just be 4th damage dealers anymore. It's going to be about your healing output much more than your damage output, although there still is some value there, and we'll talk about that. And the utility side will matter a lot, being able to mitigate and reduce the impact of incoming damage onto other players. Now, healer damage is still going to be important, but it's going to shift. Previously, you might be familiar with Holy Priest and Boon of the Ascended in Shadowlands Season 3 and Season 4, mainly Season 3, of the Holy Priest doing massive damage, even though it is very GCD intensive. There's a lot of buttons you gotta press when you place Boon of the Ascended. So it was more or less every minute you'd be able to activate your Covenant ability and spend 10 to 12 seconds just doing lots of damage. That is extremely GCD intensive to do, but it was fine because the Shadowlands dungeons, in terms of the damage they were dealing and the healing they were requiring, were very low. There was still challenge, obviously, you scale the key level, but what it was requiring the healer to do was not so much of heal, it just contribute lots of extra damage to kill stuff faster. In Dragonflight dungeons, you will be healing a lot. Starting it off, let's go down the list for what I think is going to be dominant and overpowered from what we've seen so far. First up onto our list is Resto Druid. Resto Druid, all in all, just, so wonderful and powerful, and your family will be returned to you as long as you stick to this script. This is Growl, I have them, and if you ever want to Resto Druid, by and large, wonderful output, wonderful utility that they're able to bring to the table, but most importantly, mana efficiency and passive damage make a really large difference, and that's something that Resto Druid can do quite a lot of. They're kind of the only healer, I will admit, that I haven't really been playing myself. I don't particularly find the playstyle that interesting, I'll fully admit to you guys, but when it comes to healing the high-end content, when it comes to healing keys, this is really kind of a revival for the spec, because one of the things that they were great at and really sought after for, particularly in BFA, was how well they could sort of attrition heal and maintain very high levels of output for long periods of time, being able to sort of layer their hots onto targets to be able to pump out burst healing when they needed to, or steady healing as well, depending on the situation, all make a very big difference for them. And when it comes to passive damage, there's a difference between passive damage and active damage. Passive is when I refer to being able to deal the majority of your damage. Let's say you have your damage sandwich, right? And you have going on, you might have some like mustard or onions or, bacon, lettuce, tomato, whatever. And then when you start putting that sandwich together, if most of it doesn't really require that many globals to be able to produce, then that means you have very high passive damage. So something Druids will be able to bring to the table is netting a large amount of damage out in a very quick format, which means even if they're getting extra globals to deal extra damage, it's not as big of a priority because they kind of dealt the brunt of it already. Overall, the spec has great defensives, it's able to give good defensives to other people, the output is incredibly high, and so far there's really big variances in the dungeons between the value of one healer and the value of another based off how well they can pump lots of output very quickly, and so far Druid, as well as one other, have been taking the cake there. Next up, let's talk about Evoker. They're going to be rounding out our list as number 2, and these are the top 2 that are going to be in that dominant and overpowered section. What Evoker does really well is being able to spend kind of like their combo points, their essence, to be able to augment a lot of their different cooldown abilities. And the gameplay is actually super fun in that a lot of like Holy Priest or Dispriest have a lot of different active abilities that you're sort of pressing all the time and are weaving in to the mix. Evoker has very few constant abilities that it's always casting all the time, and it more of has spending your essence, usually on things like Echo, for example, to replicate your healing to make sure that when you spend a cooldown, that it is being maximized to the fullest, to be able to spread around output, to be able to heal faraway targets, to be able to sort of blanket everybody in anticipation for movement or for damage, and the cooldowns that you do have can be very flexible in and of themselves. Dream Breath is absolutely the most dominant cooldown for the Evoker in a 5-man, because you're able to charge up to 1 breath, for example, to put a very large hot onto everybody, or you're able to fully charge it up to push more of that output. It's always the same regardless of your charge up. You can pump more of the output to instantly top people, as if you're going to do a quick revival, or you could again put up that 1 hot in anticipation of more steady and more ticking damage. That allows the spec to be able to flex its output around a few key abilities, making it pretty easy to be able to play and get into once you have that understanding of how empowerment works. And it makes it very strong to be able to plan people's cooldowns around, because you'll be able to know and sort of rank the strength of your different cooldowns to say, hey, I've got tons of output right here within my control. Hey, I'm going to use a little bit of a weaker ability. And then you're able to just plan cooldowns around very easily. The external time dilation of kind of adding like a stagger effect to your allies is wonderful. It's also an extremely low cooldown, so you can use it as a defensive for the tank, you can use it as defensive for yourself, for other players, what have you. Zephyr is particularly good for reducing a lot of the AoE damage that's happening, as a number of boss fights will have some individual damage components, but then they'll also weave in a lot of group and party-wide damage. And to this point, it's almost like bringing together a Paladin's Devotion Aura, because you are a little shoehorned into making sure it's only reducing the damage of AoE effects, sure, but when most of the danger is going to be AoE effects, boom, you have Zephyr right there to be able to help you out. The defensives for Evoker got a lot better. They're also very preemptive, so it's something that's very powerful if you know the damage patterns, and I'd say this healer overall is extremely preemptive in its nature, because yes, you can just not spend your essence and be able to put out a lot of healing out of Dream Breath or something, but you might end up having to like spam a lot more heals or spam a lot more of your mana to be able to accomplish the similar goals. And so you can spend a lot less time having to heal your allies through a bit more preemptive actions, which make it really good for healers that want to be able to weave in extra damage, because Evoker has lots of passive damage from their Fire Breath and being able to chain it into like Living Flame to cleave more damage there. But even just being able to sit there, single target a couple enemies or an enemy down with like Living Flame will deal a very high amount of damage. And if you're properly anticipating the healing that's required of you, you have so many resources around to be able to help you deal with that. Some environments where, for example, it might be difficult to be able to prepare all of that incoming output or prepare a big empowered spell to be able to heal your allies, well, you have other cooldowns at your disposal. I've messed around with Rewind as a double charge system where it's half strength. I've messed around with it with just a reduced cooldown. Being able to kind of have that while you're on the move, while you're running around is wonderful. Tip the Scales allows you to have an empowered ability instant cast and full strength. That's a wonderful resource to have on hand. And of course, some of the Life Bind, where you can leap to an ally and sort of set up a 5-second beacon, and then use an ability like Emerald Communion, which heals yourself. And then if you're full health, it'll reflect healing and spread healing to other targets. You could sort of like add beacons to the entire party, and then use things like Emerald Communion to heal yourself and just fully top everybody in the party with you as well. So the flexibility that the Evoker brings is great. The mana efficiency is particularly strong, and playing around a lot of 30, 40-second type cooldowns makes it really good difference in compared to some of the other healers that will have maybe a 2-minute cooldown here, maybe a minute cooldown there, and then there's these sort of gaps that appear in between. So there is a lot of emphasis on making sure you're flexible with those cooldowns and spacing them out appropriately, but you seem to always have healing output when you need it. You have a lot of resources to add extra defensives into the mix. Your movement speed to be able to close the gap and quickly get to other people is also insane. So Evoker in a very, very powerful position when it comes to Mythic Plus and Dragonflight. Now we covered the healers for the dominant and OP section. Now I want to talk about the healers that I think make up the high-end competitive setup as well. These are healers that I think can be represented in the 0.1% sort of cryptic hero, shrouded hero type titles, but some people will probably opt to play some of the dominant and overpowered ones just because of the fact that it could make their lives a little bit easier. All three of the healers that are going to be in this tier have a number of very good strengths, but they also are going to have some standout weaknesses that'll be more apparent that I'll be able to talk about a little bit. And they could quickly move into some of the more dominant and overpowered sections if there's additional tuning that could come around the corner. First healer, and I'd say this is also the strongest healer that I've encountered in this high-end competitive section, is Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin, even though it's not something that I really played much in Shadowlands, it's one of the healers, it was the first healer I ever played in this game, and it feels so much more reinvigorated, despite some annoyances that I've heard from like feedback forums and talking to other Holy Paladin players about some of the playstyle mechanics. Things like Dusk and Dawn and playing around a mini game of your uptimes is annoying, yes, but the additional benefits and the output is really clear and it's really easy to be able to understand. Your holy power generation is really strong as well, so the gameplay feels very fluid. And when it comes to your utility, your resources on hand, Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Sacrifice, Devotion Aura all make a really noticeable impact when you're coming into a key environment. And your ability to net out a very large amount of passive damage still exists, and it's still wonderful with things like Consecrate. Your judgment damage is phenomenal. There's some talents, I believe it's called Veneration, so that you're able to toss out extra Hammer of Wraths on hand to help prio target enemies down. Your kick is also on a wonderful short cooldown. I didn't actually mention that with the other two healers above, but obviously they still have their kicks on hand. Paladin can reach it so ridiculously easily. The defensive value for Paladin is also really good. There's a lot of magic damage that happens from the boss fight perspective, but there's also a number of encounters that have a decent amount of physical damage, or some that like spawn additional adds. And it can be kind of noticeable having the additional armor, having the additional strength and defensive value that you have on hand to be able to keep yourself alive. And everybody loves being able to have an immunity. Another thing I didn't actually mention from the other two healers above is some of the dispels. In particular, a lot of dungeons have poisons and diseases on hand, and Paladin having both. Evoker has that cauterizing flame, so they can kind of flex into any dispel. Druid has poison dispel. So there's a number of these healers that are intensely valuable because they have the correct type of dispels on hand, and Paladin, I would say, is absolutely one of them. Paladin, where they get a lot of value, is being able to very efficiently make use of their cooldowns for damage or healing, and that's always been a very big component of the spec when it comes to healing 5-mans, is when you get those areas and those gaps to be able to deal lots of extra damage, you have it and it's right there in front of you. I would say Paladin, and what makes it really strong overall, is making sure that it's in a position to be able to pump out massive healing on demand. And again, kind of like Evoker as well, when you plan out those cooldowns, you plan out those resources, these fights in dungeons, the boss fights in particular, become a lot more like raid encounters where you kind of have to map out what's the next available resource, whether it's a party's defensive, like an AMZ from your tank, or whether it's going to be your own resources, your Divine Toll, your Devotion Aura. What are you going to weave in next to start keeping people alive? One of the things I noticed in my own gameplay, kind of looking back at some of these VODs, was dealing with some of the range requirements was kind of annoying, but that's also going to be on me for making sure I'm beaconing faraway targets to help deal with the lack of mastery, and not being able to have things like Rule of Law extending your mastery anymore in Dragonflight. Definitely a bit of a downside. Also, as I mentioned, using your cooldowns for either healing or for damage can often make it so that you're not dealing quite as much damage as some of these other healers. And it's also very feast or famine at times with Paladin. When you're in between those cooldowns, they can feel like they're very lengthy and you're kind of gasping for a wings proc to be able to heal your allies. It's nowhere near as extreme as I found Shadowlands to be, thank goodness, but it's still noticeable in a few areas that those other two healers do not have as much. So very big plus sides on the utility and the burst output, but a bit gated somewhat by the cooldowns and the length that you have to be able to have compared to the other two on top. Continuing on our trend with Holy Rollers, Holy Priest is going to be taking our second place position in the high-end competitive branch, and Holy Priest just never runs out of mana. Of all the healers that I encountered, they are the one that is best able to attrition heal, maintain extremely high output for very long periods of time, but there have been a couple catches that go in with it. What I really like about Holy Priest is when I need to maintain output and when I need to maintain throughput, whether it's tank support, whether it's healing a couple different priority targets at a time. Holy Priest is always able to do it, and you always are able to play as aggressively as you want with your mana bar in a dungeon because it just does not seem to go down that much. And that's always a wonderful feeling to have. You have your usual cooldown in Apotheosis, but you're also going to be able to have a new cooldown in Divine Word, which is going to augment itself and change depending on how you're going to utilize it. So it's always going to buff one of your holy words by 50%, and you can have access to it once every minute, but there's always a special after effect. Using Sanctify, your AoE heal, will also make a healing rain of sorts over 15 seconds, which is wonderful output when you have everybody taking very steady damage, like on the tree boss in Algathar, or some of Hirja's rain. When you use it on Serenity, again, you're buffing up that Serenity, so you're pretty much lay-on-handsing somebody. You're able to reduce the mana cost, increase the crit strike chance of your flash heal and your heal, which is wonderful when you're playing a Lightweaver build, so it's a lot of single target focus. And then finally, if you use it with your Chastise, your damaging Holy Word, you're able to net out a 30% damage buff, and it used to be a 50% damage buff, but they nerfed that down. And you can pair it up with your also nerfed ability, Imperial Blaze, so that you can Divine Word, Chastise, Holy Fire, Imperial Blaze, and then cast 3 more Holy Fires, and then probably an additional one after that to be able to net out a tremendous amount of damage, whether it's single target or AoE. Holy has lost quite a bit of its passive damage, I would argue, having to use Imperial Blaze once every minute now instead of once every 30 seconds. And Imperial Blaze never really felt that passive either. It felt fine when it was a 30-second and you could kind of just use those extra Holy Fires that were instant on free globals here and there, especially when you had to move, because Holy doesn't have a lot of globals to be able to cast on the move for healing. So having very effective output when you're damaging is great. But since that nerf, you do notice Holy's damage to go down a bit. It still is in about the average or above average in terms of its damage output, but it's very dependent on the dungeon, and it's very dependent on how much active time that you need to spend healing. The positive side is your utility is pretty solid, you're going to never run out of mana, and when you can deal lots of damage, you'll be very noticeable on the meters. Symbol of Hope, still very good utility in reducing defensives, and it reduces a very good defensive for Evokers if you have a DPS Evoker in the party with you. And of course, tanks, while they're very powerful and near immortal, they may not be that way forever, so obviously being able to support your tanks that way is always a good thing. Guardian Spirit, Powered Life, there's a ton of options that the spec has at its disposal to be able to keep friends alive. The issue, and the reason that it's not in like a dominant and OP section, is the fact that its ability to burst lots of output is very tied to the cooldowns. If you're in an encounter like Ner'zhul at the end of Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, well, there's a lot of drop-off damage, so as long as people move away from the void zones, they're gonna just take a little ticking damage, and you can heal 40-45k forever if you needed to. But when you go into Hirja and you're trying to stack up multiple lightning storms and everything like that, this spec's gonna struggle some more because of the fact that it relies heavily upon Divine Word or Apotheosis or just holy words in general to oomph up people's health pools immediately, as opposed to taking your time, letting your Echo of Light do its thing. And as a result, I think the spec is more dependent on haste than ever before, because you need to just get your flash heals, your heals to the GCD as close as you possibly can to make sure that every single global you are doing everything you can to top people, because a lot of these fights, despite the intention of that 40% health and damage nerf, despite the intention to make things less bursty, most fights are still really, really bursty, and it seems like they're going to stay that way for a bit. So Holy Priest, in a good position, but they were top tier, and they got brought down a little bit in my ranking because of some of the damage nerfs, and because of that health and damage aura change that just went live like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Next up on our list, we've got the Discipline Priest. Now, I know this is probably going to be like the hottest take, I think, in this video, mainly because, you know, I'm the Disc Priest player, other people don't main it, and everyone's going to have varying views on how the spec is going to look. But I will say this, there's been a ridiculous amount of changes that have gone on, and I've really hemmed and hawed as to where I would position Discipline, and I think I finally found that ideal sort of home for where I think the spec actually lives. Plus sides, absorbs, damage reduction, defensive value. Like Holy Priest, you have access to that really reduced cooldown on fades. You kind of always can have 10% DR for yourself from that, as well as additional DR from self-casting flash heals. So you can be a lot tankier, especially when you're anticipating the damage. And Disc has sort of been the king at anticipating incoming damage and preparing for it, knowing when it's going to be going out. And so there's very, very high marks that are coming in for the spec. They also recently had a change, scaling Sins of the Many to a permanent, flat 30% damage buff, which only reduces when you have more than 5 atonements out. So this is a massive damage increase for 5-man environment, and it allows them to better scale atonement output to an appropriate level among the peers, which is something that the spec never really had before. Usually it was just like very OP in betas, like Shadowlands and BFA, and then JB would play it, and then the spec would get nerfed, and then nobody ever really played Disc in a lot of high keys, except for like end of season, maxed out gear, perfect, phenomenal, Nyalotha, Corruption, whatever. Never really ended up happening this expansion in Shadowlands, except for like maybe the beginning because fairies were good. That being said, Dragonflight, Discipline, wonderful single target output thanks to Powered Shield having about a 5-second cooldown. Your damage is actually quite strong, especially when you're utilizing it to heal. Unfortunately, your dot spread is a little bit encumbered, let's say, because of some bugs that exist that we've reported a million times. So whenever they get fixed, that'll help the gameplay out a little bit. But, not all is lovely in paradise, as there are a couple downsides, one of which is always going to be mana. When your atonement is not fully topping people off on its own, because it never really does that, you're more dependent on casting additional powered radiances. So if your 8 seconds of atonement duration doesn't top people off, well, you gotta cast another radiance and expend more mana to be able to top your allies. When you are not able to multi-dot, for example, to be able to spread more Purge the Wickeds and yield additional atonement output that way, that's going to be a stressor as well. When you use your 1.5-minute Rapture cooldown to blanket the entire party in absorbs, and then the absorbs get broken, your follow-up heal is going to be a bit more of a struggle. And the source of this, and really the big problem with this, is the change to a talent called Harsh Discipline, which cut down my penance damage by like 30 or 40% from some of the logs that I was looking at from my own experiences, and it was offering a very significant drop in my overall damage, which was also hitting my healing and making it so I had to expend additional healing to be able to get the job done. The plus side is that when you can correctly counter the incoming damage, because a lot of times it is fairly predictable, you are able to get ahead of the game, you are able to net out a lot of extra passive damage for the rest of your group. But the very large negative is playing on the back foot and not having enough atonement resources to just top people on their own by dealing damage forces you to expend more mana than some other healers to be able to get the job done, which can be very difficult when you come into more attrition-based encounters like I was talking about with Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. At the end of the instance, that's pretty much all the fight is. It's like a 3.5 minute slow burn to make sure you don't run out of mana and that people aren't standing in goop all the time. So those type of areas is where the spec can really struggle with, but when it comes to handling burst damage, and even when the spec is forced to move a little bit, they do have great resources on hand. Powered life, pain suppression, even some of the cooldown reduction for pain suppression with the squishier tanks seems to be very helpful as well. And Mass Dispel, I didn't say it with Holy Priest, but oh my god, Mass Dispel destroys bursting so easily, and there's a couple different mobs that being able to purge them, being able to remove those buffs, does make a very big difference. I didn't see too much of an impact not having an interrupt. It's nice to have, but there are a lot of mobs that if you just fear them, they won't recast anything. And so there's a number of times where like fear will be okay to be able to kind of get the job done. But as Disc and Holy are the only healers without interrupts, I didn't find them to be massive hindrances by any means. Also, Mind Soothe, AoE, pretty dang good, especially because we're in an expansion full of dragons, and Mind Soothe works on humans and dragons. So not too shabby on the discipline angle. Next up, I wanted to talk about the healers that I think are going to struggle a bit in a high-key environment, and I wanted to be able to highlight the reason why I think that these healers are going to struggle, and where I would say that they most accurately will have their struggles, have their conflicts, have, the pain and suffering and everything like that. I do think both the healers on this list are going to be able to push into the 1% of keys and maybe even 0.5% of keys. Maybe you'll have one or two of these people go in for like the Cryptic Hero or the 0.1% title, but I think that they are going to have to work a substantially harder amount to be able to get the job done, and that's what I wanted to be able to emphasize in this tier list, is not that you can't complete your 15s or something with these healers, it's that these healers are going to have to work a lot harder when you start going into the 20s, which are going to be very challenging at the start of Dragonflight. First and foremost, we've got Mistweaver. Mistweaver, I've really been enjoying in terms of the playstyle, but it always feels like there's one or two talents that are missing or just need to be designed or focused on in a dungeon environment. Being able to have a lot of your output tied to dealing damage is lovely with Ancient Teachings of the Monastery and using like Face Stomp as your activator. The gameplay is fluid, the damage is really good, especially if you can get a ton of mobs to spinning crane kick all over the place. But the downside is that you're very tied to melee range, you don't really have any sort of long arms, and whereas a Paladin can build a little bit more towards their Infusion of Light or their caster builds. They have cooldowns like Divine Favor, where they may want to just be casting a little bit here and there for very powerful oomph healing. Mistweaver can do it, but then you light that mana bar on fire and you burn it down so quickly. So there's a very large punishment that comes in when you are spread and when you are decoupled from the boss fight. So certain movement, lack of communication, if you think the tank goes left and then you go right, not having any sort of like Venthyr teleport to be able to close the gap makes a very big difference and is one of like the very big weaknesses with the spec. Also, when it comes to a lot of burst output, I've alternated between running the usual 3-minute Celestial or running a 1-minute Celestial with Crackbird, and I really have enjoyed running with that 1-minute cooldown, but it also feels like you are just pounding a lot of output in a very narrow window, doing lots and lots of healing, but after that, your follow-up just kind of drops off a cliff, and so not having really much of any strength out of Revival, it's basically hitting as if, you know, you had a little bit stronger of a Vivify. Feels really bad. Not having additional strength out of your Vivify cleaves feels pretty bad as well. You also have so many talents which spread around Renewing Mist that you end up kind of overlapping a lot of your Renewing Mists onto each other, and there's not really any extra reward to it. It's not like you have like a Germination type effect where you can stack multiple Renewing Mists onto people or get multiple Vivify cleaves out of it or anything along those lines, which is something I think would tremendously help the spec when it comes to a 5-man environment. Unfortunately, it seems like you spread a little bit too many Renewing Mists that you need, and it's also a bit more difficult because of Rising Mist capping the extension of your healing over time effects. You sort of have to spend or even waste extra time reapplying your HOTS, when in reality, it feels like if you just had the option to keep on extending them ad infinitum, you could do that as long as you're able to stay in melee range, as long as the pulls are still going on, and you could chain and be very mana efficient otherwise. I know that they changed it because of corruption. That's a whole big long story. But I love the playstyle and the gameplay surrounding Mistweaver, but I am concerned that the movement and that just boss mobility and other mechanics or other people around you pushing you away from the boss fight, or when you don't have cooldowns on hand like your Celestial, those are going to be the areas that the spec is going to be able to struggle, and your only alternative is to just spam the Vivify button as much as you possibly can and hope that you don't run out of mana before the boss fight ends. It's unfortunate. The Innervate mana pot that's coming out in Dragonflight will help a ton, and does help a ton for the spec, but relying on like a 15-second Innervate pot, which I think would get nerfed, seems a little bit far-fetched. And last but not least is going to be Resto Shaman. And I wanted to give some context because I actually really enjoy playing Resto Shaman when it came to a 5-man environment. One of the biggest things is Shaman historically, if you zoom out over the entire history of M+, they've been one of the biggest losers for many, many years. So Shadowlands was a tremendous time for the spec to be able to net out lots of damage. But, like I mentioned at the start of this video, Shadowlands dungeons didn't ask nearly as much of healers as things like Battle for Azeroth's dungeons did. Now that we're going into Dragonflight, your healers are going to have to heal, and I gotta tell you, I love how Shaman plays in a 5-man, but there are a couple of issues that I sort of have with it that I sort of have to deal with or find a way around to work harder to be able to do things that like other healers are able to flex into much more simply. Resto Shaman's passive damage is incredibly bad, unfortunately. There is no more Vesper Totem, and while I personally am glad of that because Vesper I found was kind of dumb, Acid Rain as a terrible successor and like needs to be buffed multiple times or needs to be uncapped in its damage. I'd even love to have something that would give you like Stormkeeper procs or just free Chain Lightning procs or something along those lines to help you weave in damage a bit more efficiently. But if you can sit there and just damage, then your output will be pretty good. Problem is, that's just more rare in general, and that's something that Dragonflight dungeons will not let you do a lot of. And so you can very quickly fall off by a large amount with that damage. When it comes to utility, Shaman's got everything that you need. It is very much that Swiss Army knife to flex into a lot of different roles. But when it comes to their damage reduction resources, they're a lot more sparse than some of the other healers. There's some of the totems which I weren't really finding that useful at all to reduce your physical damage. Obviously, you're going to have Spirit Link totem on hand. Your Healing Tide, for example, is going to do, you know, a bit of output. But in general, I was finding myself leaning very heavily on Primordial Wave. I know some people were playing around with Chain Heal builds, and they were getting decent success with those as well. And then you're leaning really heavily on things like Ancestral Guidance and on your Ascendance to beef up your Cloud Bursts to be able to pump output. In that vein, Shaman did wonderful at being able to start countering a lot of heavy incoming damage. But the issue I came into with Shaman was high movement when you rely very heavily upon, you know, your Spirit Walker's Grace, and once that's been expended or spent, fights like the Tree become a lot more difficult in Algathar Academy. Not to mention, you're doing almost no damage while that's going on. And being able to have some kind of instant ability to be able to quickly push people's health pools up, sort of how Priest has their Power Word Life, was very noticeable as not having. You pretty much have to anticipate and over-anticipate incoming damage, because if you're sitting there casting a Surge onto a target, there are times where they may already be dead, and you're just not quite able to be able to catch up. I think it was Nature's Swiftness on that 1 minute cooldown can help a little bit from time to time, but I definitely found more moments where I felt like I was just kind of missing an extra talent or an extra bit of oomph to be able to kind of get that job done. When it came, again, to attrition-focused fights, Shaman, just like Holy Priest, could just be healing the entire party all day long and having a great, phenomenal time with it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of boss fights at current tuning in Dragonflight, which become very high movement and very high burst damage. The last boss of Ruby Life Pools is like that, where the dragon will fly up into the air, dot everybody in the raid for like 90 or 100% of their health, requiring some extra healing to be able to get them out alive. And you've got to be able to move, position yourself, heal, not block other people, spread around your cooldowns, make sure you're not getting kicked, all of these different things. And Spirit Link doesn't really help you. Physical damage, Totem isn't really going to help you by any means. Having, you know, piddly little absorbs out of Earthenwall Totem is not going to help you for these more challenging situations. I think it's not that bad getting around issues where players are far off or they're ranged, because the mana economy, I do think of Shaman is like pretty solid across the board, but I did find myself constantly lacking when it comes to overall damage. Found myself very constantly lacking when there was a lot of movement going on, even kind of getting dragged into the vortex in Ruby Life Pools and trying to make sure I have enough distance, but I'm in range of everybody and I can sit there and keep getting dragged while I'm getting casted on. All of those things sort of rolled together and made it a lot more difficult to be able to sort of keep everybody alive, keep the entire party healthy, and still be able to do the same things that some of the other healers did. That being said, I really did enjoy playing a big variety of the healers. I'd say in terms of gameplay and playstyle, that disc is still my favorite, even though it can be a little aggravating sometimes. But it does feel a lot better playing Paladin, which I dropped for a lot of Shadowlands because I just didn't enjoy the playstyle. It feels a lot more intuitive playing Holy Priest without flash concentration. Mistweaver is very fun, although that melee requirement's very punishing. And Shaman does feel a lot more reinvigorated. Preservation Evoker, also, like I said, quite fun. I think all of the healers and my enjoyment of them is a lot higher than Dragonflight, and I'm looking forward to playing a big variety of them. Maybe one of these days I'll play Druid, but they can absolutely enjoy being extremely powerful when it comes to the 5-man environment, and I think you'd probably need to see some pretty substantial nerfs for anything like that to change. Because what they have in their kit, their resources, how they deal damage, how they deal healing, are all just quite powerful. So if you're interested in playing any of these healers and going into high keys, I'd say do it. But also, you know, make sure that you're taking that time to network, to build relationships with people, and to really build a core group, because that's going to be the only way that you're going to actually get into the 0.1% environment. If you just slot in a Druid or slot in an Evoker and then just try to LFG your way to the top, you are going to struggle and you are going to fail, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to be able to get any sort of high-end title. So do be sure to keep that in mind. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. And Growl, please release my family. I let them know that Druid's okay, please, man.